Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's regulatory panel discussion, whose topic is REACH, Ask the Experts. For those of you joining us for the first time, I am Julia Ray, Technical Editor at Cosmetics Business, and I will be moderating this discussion. And it is my great pleasure to introduce you in a few moments to the experts mentioned in the title. We will have two representatives from the European Chemicals Agency, or ECHA. William Brouwer is Senior Legal Advisor for ECHA, advising the agency on all matters relating to the interpretation and application of the REACH regulation, while Laurence Hofstadt is Senior Scientific Officer, Hazard Assessment Directorate, and she is an expert in toxicology. Joining them are Francesca Rapolla, Regulatory Affairs Manager for the UK-based Cosmetic, Toiletry and Perfumery Association, or CTPA, and Julia Baines, who is Science Policy Manager at PETA UK. Francesca is responsible for UK and EU regulatory matters concerning cosmetic products at the CTPA, covering the cosmetics regulation, as well as REACH and matters relating to Brexit. PETA's Julia Baines, meanwhile, advises on strategies to minimise the use of animals under REACH on behalf of the Animal Rights Organisation. We will be taking audience questions throughout this session, so please do use the live discussion box, which is to the right of your screen just there, and click on the question section to submit all your queries for our panel. So despite the fact that I am down to speak and give an introduction about the REACH regulation, I'm aware, painfully, that I am by far and away the least qualified person to speak about REACH appearing on your screens for the next hour. So I think the best possible move would be for me to throw William and Laurence from ECHA straight into the ring here and really ask, guys, what exactly is REACH? When did it enter into force? What does it entail? And who in the industry does it principally impact?
Yes, good afternoon. So thank you for the introduction, Julia. Yes, well, I'm not sure exactly what the audience is aware of, so I'll just start a bit higher level. REACH entered into force in 2008. It was aiming to replace quite a number of existing pieces of legislations, and it provides requirements and obligations on industry, for example, to provide data to ensure safe use of chemicals in Europe and to protect human health and the environment. That's really the high level obligations and scope. And in practice, any chemical company who has manufacturing site or importing capacities in Europe and produce or import substances above 1 ton per year have the obligation to register under REACH and then provide a certain set of data depending on the tonnage ban they have on the EU market, and then fulfill further information requirements, data information in case there would be further need for regulating the substance in the EU. And these, by extent, also implies that the registrants have also to provide information on uses and manufacturing process and also how the risks are managed in the either in their manufacturing sites or in the downstream users or with the downstream users. I think this is a bit of the high level introduction. I don't know if William, you want to add something.
I can, of course, add something very briefly. The standard information requirements which companies need to provide in their registration dossiers, they can be, they are actually, depending on the tonnage, they are defined as certain tests. So they can be arguably animal tests as well, and they're specifically indicated as animal tests. On the other hand, the REACH regulation does require companies to do animal testing as a last resort, which means, therefore, that they need to look for alternative methods before they provide an animal test. And the REACH regulation sets out a number of situations where such testing is not needed, and there are certain adaptations which can be provided to what we call the REACH standard information requirements. What do we do with all this data? Actually, is that we then assess the safety of the substance, and we decide and we assist the European Commission whether further risk management measures are needed with respect to these substances, which can lead to, for example, classification and labeling of the substances. If they have, for example, hazardous properties towards the environment or to human health, then they may need to be classified. It can also even lead to specific measures proposing that substances will have their uses restricted or be subject to a special process called authorization. This is all within the REACH, what I call the REACH framework, but of course there are this may also feed into the information we collect, may also feed into other pieces of legislation. So and of course this is EU specific, so it's a regulation which is applicable to all the EU member states, which the UK was of course recently part of. And therefore anyone based in the EU is bound by these REACH obligations.
Fantastic. Thank you for a bit of that explanation there. So obviously REACH is important across a wide range of industries, not just the cosmetics industry. But how specifically, because this is a cosmetics audience, how does it influence the cosmetics manufacturing industry specifically, and those companies supplying it as well? Maybe Francesca, if I could bring you into the discussion.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Julia, for the introduction as well earlier. So, of course, REACH is an additional regulation that applies to cosmetic products, but it doesn't apply to the finished cosmetic products. It applies to the ingredients, the cosmetic ingredients, either on their own, so as raw materials, or within the mixture, which is the finished cosmetic product. And this is how REACH applies to cosmetic ingredients. And it's important to highlight as well that REACH assesses something different from the cosmetics regulation. So the cosmetics regulation assesses the safety of the cosmetic product for the consumer, so when the cosmetic product is used by the consumer, whereas REACH looks at the environmental impact of the ingredients or the safety on the use of ingredients in the workplace. So it's a completely different remit versus the cosmetics regulation. So in some ways they complement each other, but they apply different to cosmetic ingredients and cosmetic products. And we can say that within the cosmetics industry, we can identify different actors within the supply chain, and REACH applies in different ways depending on the level in the supply chain of a cosmetics path, let's say. So if we look at the raw material suppliers or the ingredients manufacturers, they are more likely identified as registrants. So because they actually make the ingredient, they would have that safety dossier, the safety information to be able to compile the registration, for example. Then we can see that the ingredient supplier may supply directly a manufacturer of finished cosmetic product, or there can be one, two, or several distributors in between. So there is like a, very long chain and a very long chain of exchange of information that needs to go all the way down to the downstream user, who would be the cosmetics manufacturer or the brand owner. So it's really important within the supply chain that there is communication, because first of all, the downstream user has to ensure that the chemical used, so the cosmetic ingredient used, is registered within REACH. Otherwise, they may have to be the ones registering it. But also they need to know how to use the ingredient and how to safely manage if there is something going on while maybe they use the ingredient for manufacturing. So that's why the communication within the supply chain is really important. It could sometimes be difficult because, as I said, it's not supplier manufacturer directly, but there can be different other companies in between. So it's a very long, chain of communication where information has to be passed through. But there is a communication obligation under REACH regulations. It's really important that this flows very nicely. And, this is why logically, in theory, works very nicely logically, but then, in the actual real life scenario, there can be some complications in terms of the communication within the supply chain. And it's really important for companies to understand, especially if they are downstream users like brand owners or manufacturers of cosmetic products, that they have visibility of where the ingredients they're using are coming from. So are they sourced from, I don't know, we are talking about EU REACH. So are they sourced from EU suppliers? So they might be already registered. Do they cover the tonnage that is used by those downstream users? If they come from outside of the EU, is that non-EU supplier having an only representative in the EU to cover that registration, or is the manufacturer of finished cosmetic products having to do the registration themselves? So it's really complicated, and it's really important for the downstream user to have full visibility of the chemicals they use, so they know where they're coming from, if they are registered, how to manage them safely. And maybe they can also work with the suppliers to understand if there is maybe a better or, sort of safer alternative that can be used for the purpose of the cosmetic product.
Lovely. Not to deviate too much from the topic, but is there any advice you could provide to these downstream users with regards to sort of keeping a really tight eye on their supply chain? Francesca.
What we advice to our members is to have a full mapping of your supply chain and what ingredients you use, how much you use or import into your EU market, because ultimately, there is a 1 ton threshold for chemicals for the application of REACH. Also, know if your ingredient may be exempt from REACH registration, because there are some instances for that as well. But really important, have communication within your supply chain. That may be easier if you deal directly with the ingredient supplier. It may be more difficult if there are several companies in between, as I said. But it's really important that you keep up that communication, that you know if there is also, for example, any update on the safe use of that ingredient, because maybe the ingredient manufacturer keeps doing research, maybe they find there can be some changes, and you do need to know about those if you are a downstream user. So the communication is really important. And in the case that you do have, suppliers from outside of the EU, raise awareness about the REACH regulation and the obligations on the REACH regulation with that non-EU supplier, because that will help you be able to comply yourself, but also be able to have the information you need to ensure compliance from your side. So mapping of chemicals, how much, how many, where they're from, and communicate with your supply chain up to the top of the supply chain with your ingredient supplier.
Excellent. Great advice there. So I can see we've had a question through from the audience, and this is going to be on Brexit. What else? So they're asking, how has the UK's withdrawal from the EU affected UK companies' compliance with REACH? I don't know who might be best to answer that. Possibly Francesca. Sorry, I feel like I'm picking on you now.
When it comes to Brexit, I'm used to this, basically. I'm just trying to organize the thoughts, because there is a lot, actually, in terms of how Brexit impacted REACH. Because there are regulatory impacts, but also trade impacts. So I might go for the regulatory impacts first and then treat the trade impacts. So from a regulatory point of view, Brexit had as a consequence the UK setting up its own regulatory framework for chemicals, which is UK REACH. And of course, when you have two sets of regulations to comply with. If you sell to both markets, of course, you have duplication of requirements. And in order to be able to comply with both requirements, you do need to find, more administrative resources, so actually people to be able to comply with both sets, but also you have some extra costs. So this is the first impact. But then from a regulatory point of view, to be able to comply with UK REACH, I have to say that communication within the supply chain that you had for EU REACH, it's even more vital now, because you need to map the chemicals, not just for the EU, but you need to split the chemicals that would go into the UK market from that EU tonnage. And more importantly, you need to divide the UK between GB, Great Britain, and Northern Ireland, because of course Northern Ireland continues to follow EU REACH, whereas GB is the one that follows UK REACH. So you really need to understand where your products are going, where your chemicals are coming from. And if it was difficult before, now it's even more difficult. Depending on that, you might discover maybe you don't hit the 1 ton threshold for the GB market. But if you do, then you also need to understand if your suppliers will comply with UK REACH. Because again, if they are, you may be able to maintain your downstream user role and you have specific obligations. But if they don't, you may be the one having to carry out the registrations under UK REACH. And if that is the case, how can you access intellectual property and safety dossier and safety information from your supplier? They might give it to you, they might not give it to you. If they don't, how can you submit the full registration? So from that, what do you do? Shall I continue to use that chemical? Shall I change my supply chain? But then if I change raw material, how is that going to affect my finished product? So there are a lot of things that will then, unleash a lot of other issues. And then from a trade point of view as well, I think I touched a bit when I talked about the, GB and Northern Irish market, but also you need to consider that free movement of goods between the UK and the EU has stopped. So you might have some issues in actually sourcing some of those chemicals from the EU. So you do need to consider customs requirements for those chemicals coming from the EU into GB. So it has impacted quite strongly the cosmetics industry. I have to say, in the short term, we have feedback from members. Things seem to be, I don't want to say going well, because they're not going well, but let's say that the impact will be seen in the longer term rather than in the short term. So when we get to the point of the full registration under UK REACH in 2, 4, or 6 years. So that is what we need to work towards to minimize impact to the industry.
Thank you, Francesca. That was very comprehensive. From ECHA's point of view and kind of overarchingly beyond the cosmetics industry as well, what have been the ramifications of Brexit and this new UK REACH for you?
Yeah, I can address that question. In fact, how we had to set up in place actually a lot of information about what companies should do when because of the Brexit developments, and in particular, how do companies continue to market their products and substances in the EU. And and because actually the status changes, a UK manufacturer of a chemical who wants to sell his product into the EU market is no longer is actually becoming an exporter of the substance, and therefore would need to register actually his substance again in the UK. So we try to find ways to so during the transitional period there were ways published on how UK companies and EU companies could avoid having to do double work. And one example would be, for example, to set up a what we call an only representative within the EU, so a company which can represent the interests of the UK entity, and to change actually their UK EU registration to a registration which is based in another member state country. We had also there were questions from a lot of EU downstream users especially in the field of risk management. What about how can we now purchase? What do we need to do if our UK supplier is no longer is actually not registering the substance, or is deciding not to transfer its registration to an EU-based company? And actually there the advice would be then you have to register yourself actually, or you have to find another supplier. So it does have consequences on the supply chain as well, and we see that also from the agency side, and we've got a lot of requests, in fact, from companies who in fact change their legal entity. So they are transferring registrations to or their businesses to other member states, so that they can continue their business. Or you have also quite a big move to Northern Ireland, funnily enough. So and so that then and it's a way to ensure that one can have one's foot in both jurisdictions as well. But with respect to the UK reach, I don't have much to add what Francesca says. I mean, she knows much more about it than me, but I know that there is a kind of an idea that they do have matching requirements, so it is aimed to avoid too much repetition of the duplication of things.
Thank you. So, William, you touched upon this a little bit in your introduction, and Julia, we haven't forgotten you, we haven't ignored you. You know, this is one of the reasons why I wanted you to be on this panel so much. So really, last year, the ECHA Board of Appeal, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe 2 appeals were rejected concerning, it was requested vertebrate animal testing on ingredients which were intended solely for use in cosmetics to meet the safety requirements under REACH. And I think, you know, maybe for our audience, it would be helpful to kind of clarify it, you know, now we are all here, the relationship between the requirements of the REACH regulation on the one hand, which obviously is highly necessary for workplace safety and environmental safety, and then also the relationship but under which the testing of materials on animals may be requested, and requirements of the EU cosmetics regulation, whereby the testing of finished products and materials you know, has long been banned. So maybe to begin, Julia, could you perhaps give us kind of Peter's perspective here on this, you know, quite contentious issue?
Yeah, sure. I'd really enjoy that, because I think it's important to realise that there is probably a theory in how these 2 regulations should be getting along with each other, and then there's a reality in what has actually happened. So starting with the theory, the purpose of the cosmetics regulation, crystal clear: ensure human health, and that's what it says in Article 1, ensure the safety for human health to allow the free market of cosmetics products and ingredients. So that's basically, cosmetics regulation is about making sure we've got the rules in place for putting safe cosmetic products and ingredients on the EU market. And those rules to allow companies to do that are also very clear, because they explicitly state that to have new ingredients and products on the market, then to ensure their safety, that data must be based on non-animal data now. So that's since the full implementation of the regulation in 2013, that any new data generated should be based on non-animal safety assessment methods. So that's a cosmetics regulation, particularly clear. And in essence, REACH actually has very similar objectives. And we heard earlier, there's some core pillars to REACH, and one of those is to make sure, again, safety of humans and the environment, which we heard about earlier, ensuring free circulation on the EU market. The third pillar that wasn't mentioned earlier, which is also actually in Article 1 of REACH, is to ensure promotion of non-animal methods. That's also a key objective of REACH. And as William mentioned earlier, there's the last resort obligation, which is a requirement to only test on animals as a last resort. So actually, in that essence, the theory is ensuring safety and promoting non-animal methods wherever possible. So there is actually a lot of overlap between those two regulations. So considering how they should work together, it's our view that where you have a cosmetics ingredient, you should be working to ensure that safety requirements are met only using non-animal methods. You shouldn't ever be resorting to new tests on animals for this particular purpose. But the reality is in that since 2013, in the last few years, we know that there have been numerous test requirements under REACH. Many of those have come under to the appeal board. It's not just been these two cases, there's been others before then. And so we know that the reality is that actually since implementation of animal testing marketing bans, there's been test requirements that have mandated the use of over 10,000 mice, rats, fish, rabbits, and other animals. So we know that animals are still being used in tests of cosmetics ingredients. Some of those test requirements are for ingredients only ever used for cosmetics purposes. And so that begs the question that if the purpose of the cosmetics regulation is to ensure that ingredients are marketed safely using and relying only on non-animal data, in those instances where we have these exclusive use ingredients and there can be no other reason for getting those ingredients onto the market other than for cosmetics purposes, because they are exclusive use ingredients, we really should not be asking for new animal test data. So what do we do? How can the two regulations interact? Well, in those instances, this is where the regulators and industry need to work very, very closely together to look at the non-animal methods that are available, what is needed to meet the REACH data requirements. And there are a number of options that can be used in terms of in vitro methods, computer modeling, reading across from similarly structured substances, and also using case studies, looking at the different exposure scenarios. And we know that there are companies doing fantastic work in developing those case studies to show actually that the methods that are used to demonstrate consumer health, exact same methods used to demonstrate worker health, because we are all humans, whether you're a consumer or a worker. But the important difference is the kind of exposure that those two parties might be party to. But we also have to remember REACH doesn't work solely just based on exposure. It's a tonnage related regulation. So the higher the tonnage you manufacture at, the bigger demand in terms of information requirements, or i.e. test requirements. So the higher the tonnage can correlate with an increased demand on animal tests. And that's what we're seeing, more tests at these higher tonnage bands. So that's more rats and rabbits being used in reproductive toxicity tests, repeat dose tests, and those kinds of endpoints. So what we are asking for is that the purpose of the cosmetics regulation not be undermined or circumvented by the REACH regulation, but to look at working more for how the regulation may be flexible in accepting the non-animal methods. What's the data required? What can be accepted, and how can we ensure that actually ingredient sets have been on the market for decades already? Some of these that have come under appeal, they're already there on the market, they've been in existence for decades, but new data is still being requested. And rightly so, we should ensure safety, but we need to make sure we're asking for safety in the right way.
Thank you, Julia. I was going to say, do any of the other panelists maybe have something to say to that, add to it, or maybe refute, depending on how you feel?
Well, maybe I'll start on behalf of the agency. or maybe I'll say on behalf of myself. Perhaps I should not say on behalf of the agency, because I am giving here partly my personal view, I've been following this issue quite closely, as Julia, well, the other Julia is aware, and we have. So I think that the issue is that under REACH, what we examine is information which is submitted by registrants, and we examine if and we check in a process called evaluation, does the dossier meet the information requirements or not? And we do an assessment. If they don't, we ask for the missing data. And that would be because we don't, and that would be usually then asking for the specific test which is missing. A registrant can, of course, in response to that, provide an adaptation. So if they have already good adaptation arguments within the sphere of the cosmetics legislation, that same adaptation could obviously be also given within the framework of REACH. But to my knowledge, we have not encountered those kind of adaptations. We've seen more I would call the standard adaptations, which Julia Baines also referred to, like read across or weight of evidence, but which, according to our assessment, were not good enough. The information was not good enough to support that the substance met the safety requirements. Mind you, what ECHA has done, and this is in discussion with the European Commission, because ECHA is not responsible for the cosmetics regulation. So we are just looking at issues from the REACH perspective and what is necessary under REACH. So there is a provision in REACH which says this regulation applies without prejudice to animal testing under the cosmetics regulation, or within the scope of. And so we had to understand, well, what does this mean? And we consulted the European Commission on this, and we published actually an information note. And basically, we assessed this and said, okay, in cases where a substance has mixed uses, so not only used in cosmetics, but also used for because a manufacturer of a substance can use it for can sell it to many different kinds of downstream users. It could be used also for let's say for making other products. In those cases, for mixed uses, you need to fully abide with the REACH information requirements. In situations where the substance is solely used for the purposes of cosmetic products, we say for environmental requirements, REACH fully applies. That's because the cosmetics regulation does not regulate the environmental safety. It even explicitly says so. However, for human health safety, we say we only need information to show to determine workplace safety. So we do not assess, and we do not need to assess anything about the risks or hazards of the substances to consumers. And this is where maybe there is a disagreement, is whether whether the information which we ask for workplace safety, whether we can ask that or not under the REACH framework. And I think that was part of the discussion which was before our Board of Appeal, and the Board of Appeal confirmed that as long as it's about workplace safety, we can ask for this information. On the other hand, companies can also, if they have data showing that there is no exposure of the substance at the workplace, then they would also be able to waive the information requirements. But it would demand showing no or very limited exposure to the substance at the workplace.
If I can also bounce on exactly on this last point, it's true that REACH is about tonnage put on the market or available on the market, let's say, but exactly on the point that William was just raising, exposure is also a factor in the sense that if indeed the workers or the setting in the industry is such that there is no exposure to worker during formulation, for example, because it's everything under strictly controlled condition. Or if there is no, during formulation, it would be directly imported and not further processed in the EU. There is also, again, possibility to waive the information, and therefore the cosmetics regulation is indeed sufficient, so to speak, or applies fully. And yes, of course, here I was talking only again when in the case of use is only in cosmetics products, so one type of use. So that's the indeed the nuance. Exposure is taken into account in this case, or in many others actually, but yes, it's part of the adaptation possible.
Thank you, Laurence. We've actually had a question in from the audience on. Oh, apologies, Francesca. I'll let you answer first.
Sorry, I wanted to jump in as well on this. I mean, just to support what William mentioned, that there is a guidance document from ECHA on the interaction between REACH and the cosmetics regulation. And it's really important to highlight that where a substance is not just for cosmetics use, it may need to be tested on animals for the purposes of REACH, but because it has got other uses and not just cosmetics, and the cosmetics industry has no control on the other uses. So the ban applies to those substances that are only for cosmetics use. So in that case, the animal testing ban under the cosmetics regulation is triggered when the substance is not just for cosmetics use, but it's also for other uses. The animal testing ban doesn't apply, and the cosmetics regulation and the cosmetics industry has no control on the use of the substance in other regulations or in other products. And it's really important to highlight here as well that in this scenario, the data that is generated by the animal testing on that substance for other uses and not cosmetics cannot be used to assess the safety under the cosmetics regulation. So I wanted to highlight this difference, and it's really important to distinguish between a substance only for cosmetics use, which is under our control and the animal testing ban applies, and a substance that is for other uses and it's not under our control when it falls under other regulations.
Thank you, and thank you for stopping me there. I almost missed the hand. So we've got a question again. It's still on this topic. Here saying, who or when is it determined if an ingredient requires animal testing under REACH, and who approves the testing? ECHA, maybe one of you guys might answer that.
I'm just trying to unmute myself. Yes, I'm unmuted myself. It seems to be a struggle with my my Teams application. When we are an EU regulatory body, so when we instruct a company to do an animal test, that is actually a pass which can be given to that is evidence that you are allowed to do a test. That's how, and this can be shown to the relevant laboratory which needs to do the test. So look, I've been asked to do this. Now, this is notwithstanding, of course, the obligation of the company itself. Even when ECHA imposes a test in its decision, the company is still under an obligation to see if there are alternative methods available. So an alternative way to address the information requirement. And so they can actually, if they do find an alternative method, can always still submit that to ECHA, and it will be assessed by ECHA in what we call the follow-up. But of course, it must not be some nonsense, what I call a nonsense adaptation, which is to aim to gain time, because I would say it's a one-stop shot. So you have a second chance. But then after that, if we get something which is not good enough, we would ask enforcement authorities to make sure that the decision is properly implemented. But in principle, it's our decision which is giving that competence. Now, There is a different question is what do you do with that animal data which you have produced and given to ECHA for the purposes of the REACH regulation? Can you also use it for the purposes of the cosmetics regulation? And if you would, I'm not going to give I cannot give an ECHA view because ECHA is not responsible for cosmetics. But I think what Francesca says kind of echoes my understanding, my personal understanding of the issue. But I cannot, which is that normally you should not rely on animal testing data for the purpose of demonstrating the safety of the cosmetic ingredient. So that is that is not an ECHA view I'm giving here or a Commission view. That's my understanding when just reading the legislation. And I think that's just a point I wanted to add as well.
Thank you, William. Again, we have, and maybe Julia, maybe this is one for you. Somebody's asking, how are alternative methods to animal testing developing, and how close are we coming to entirely replacing animal testing?
Actually, since the animal testing bans were being even just discussed way before 2013, at that point when the debates were going on in Parliament and between the Commission, industry were under enormous pressure at that time to put a lot of resources into the development of various non-animal methods. And I have to say, hands down, they did a fantastic job, because give them a deadline and they came to it. By 2013, we had brilliant replacements for skin and eye tests, excellent replacements now for skin sensitization. And these are the kinds of tests that can be used not just for cosmetic substances, but a lot more broadly across many different types of chemical substances, and even in the pharmaceutical sector as well. So there's broad applications. And it's perfectly true that what you don't necessarily have in vitro in-lab methods that can be direct replacements for every single animal test. It's often not a one replacement fits all. It can often be a battery of tests or a battery of approaches. So there has been talk about adverse outcome pathways, for example, which looks at very mechanistic biological functions and how you might try and solve questions and answer questions along the different kind of routes within the body that a substance might take, and try and solve it at different points of what is happening in the body and answering very specific questions. And there's various computer models as well. And all of these, I think William mentioned earlier, a weight of evidence approach. So you can be applying the lab methods, the computer methods, and the other methods, including existing data, because particularly for cosmetic substances, there's a big wealth of existing data based on animal studies, human studies, and other types of studies, which you can pull together to put into that dossier, that package of information that's often required by the regulatory authorities. So yes, it's totally possible, particularly within the cosmetic sector, to not need more tests on animals.
Can I give another point?
Absolutely.
And complete indeed the answer? So indeed what Julia said regarding the in vitro methods to assess skin irritation, eye irritation, skin sensitization, indeed have been very well managed and developed and validated, and they are also now part of the information requirements under REACH, the standard information requirements, which means that a registrant is not expected to run an in vivo test in the first go under REACH. They must do perform an in vitro test. We are not expecting an in vivo test, and there we come to sometimes a bit of how do you say? The only word that comes is funny situation. That's probably not the appropriate one, but we open a dossier and we see that there is an in vivo test performed, or at least submitted. It may have been performed before the start of REACH, meaning in that sense, then they have the opportunity to provide it. It's not that it's newly performed before of REACH, so there is no breach in the last resort principle, and then there wouldn't be an in vitro test. So there we are faced with actually one standard information requirement is not fulfilled, but we rely on the existing in vivo information. So that's, and of course there we don't send a decision to the registrant requesting to have an in vitro test being performed, which wouldn't be necessarily an issue, but it's extra burden and it's extra cost for industry from that point of view. But then of course, on the other hand, we also have the requirements for longer term testing. And indeed, what Julia explains, there is all this road towards the, using the adverse outcome pathways. And there, the way so of course, these methodologies haven't been fully validated, and indeed REACH functions a lot on one hand with validated methods, but also fulfilling other requirements under REACH, for example, Article 13, which explains that any test needs to be performed according to certain criteria of validity and quality. And if that's what also we assess in weight of evidence, or when we evaluate the dossier or the data provided, is whether the information we read is answering some of these criteria of validity. And that's where indeed the message we give to the outside world is not that clear, because our only answer is do the test. But before we come to that decision, we have looked at whether the validity criteria of these test methods or the information we want to see have been provided. And this is often where they haven't, because indeed those very mechanistic methods don't necessarily look at them. So that's indeed where we have a bit of, there are still discrepancies indeed. So I just wanted to confirm that we are also looking at these methodologies and ways of not providing in vivo information, but it's not possible for all standard information requirements.
Although it's probably also worth pointing out that actually many of the studies requiring animals haven't been validated to the same standards that the accepted non-animal methods have been validated to. So we know, for example, that tests on animals do suffer from profound problems with reproducibility. So you do the study once, do it again, you're not always guaranteed to get the same result. That's a very accepted problem with many different types of animal studies, and also the overall positive toxicity rate of tests using animals. That's estimated to be around about 69%. So that means that 2/3 of the time you can translate the results that you've had in animals across to humans, 1/3 of the time you can't. So, and when you're looking at the absence of toxicity, so you've not seen an effect in an animal, translating that effect over to humans is actually even more problematic. So it's not always just a case that we don't have validated non-animal tests. Sometimes there's a problem just treating the animal test as being the gold standard, because it's not a particularly high bar.
Okay, I can see everyone's this is a really great topic, but we've got a question in which it slightly deviates us now, from one of our listeners. They are asking, and I have to admit, I've never heard this term before, so I hope you guys have. What about the pre-existing materials and grandfathering? How can we check compliance for both the EU and the UK? I think this is going back to Brexit here. Grandfathering, has anyone heard of that?
Yeah, grandfathering basically means that data that's already been approved and accepted under EU REACH could actually be used under UK REACH. And that's what the government have said, that where that data has already been accepted, it can be grandfathered across. So that's a good thing in terms of animal tests, because that's a way of making sure we're not duplicating data, particularly for animal studies where that is a real risk. So that's what grandfathering means.
Can I just
Thank you
build
for
on that?
clarifying. Oh,
Sorry.
yes, absolutely.
But, I mean, there is the mention of grandfathering, but of course, it doesn't mean that the dossier can be directly transferred under UK REACH, because there are issues of intellectual properties, of the data being owned by the company and by the consortium in EU REACH, and also under EU REACH legislation, the data cannot be used for the purposes of other regulations. So the concept of grandfathering under UK REACH means that, yes, in the short term, a chemical that has already been registered under EU REACH can continue to be used in the UK under UK REACH by doing a notification, but then in the longer term, there is the legal obligation to submit the full dossier. So that is, let's say, the challenge, because you cannot take the dossier from EU REACH if you don't own that data and submit it under UK REACH. So there could be the need in the longer term to repeat some of the tests to be able to fulfill the obligations under UK REACH. And this is one of the issues that the industry has been flagging. So, it is called grandfathering, but it's not how can I say, full grandfathering. It is in the short term, but not in the long term.
Okay, interesting, really interesting. So recently, the European Commission's chemical strategy to promote safe and sustainable chemicals was announced. So firstly, maybe someone can tell us a little bit about what this is exactly, and will it have an impact on REACH? What will its impact be? Again, will it impact other European regulations that are relevant to cosmetics? So I'm thinking, CLP. And what can we really expect from that? And if anyone wants to answer, I don't know who would prefer to answer, but feel free to jump in.
Okay, maybe I start. So indeed, the European Commission has adopted this new chemical strategy at the end of last year, and it's basically part also of the EU zero pollution ambition, part of the Green Deal. So it aims to better protect the citizen and the environment from harmful chemicals. So it's overarching already what has happened under REACH, and it's really an activity and a focus from the Commission, and it may request support from other bodies, and of course it impacts and may impact, or it does impact ECHA, because it will impact or have some effect downwards on REACH, definitely, indeed, and on the CLP regulation. So ECHA is basically consulted at the moment to see what to support in the preparatory work from the European Commission.
Fantastic, thank you. And Julia, from PETA's perspective there as well, I mean, will this have an impact on the work that you do you think?
It's going to have a huge impact, because the chemical strategy for sustainability is something that came about under the EU's Green Deal, and it's set a task upon the Commission to look at more sustainable regulation of chemicals across a number of different regulations. So not just REACH and CLP, but it also brings in biocides, pesticides, the whole lot. And this is why we often hear things about one substance, one assessment type approach. And in principle, that sounds fantastic. It sounds like a brilliant opportunity for streamlining, applying data that might have been generated in one sector and being able to apply that to other sectors. But what it is also bringing with it is great dangers, because it's also pushing forward what we feel is actually in a great rush and a dangerous rush. It's pushing forward for the generation of new data, for example, for endocrine disruptors, where the methods available are not quite there for what is needed for regulatory purposes. So we just don't have, we talked about validation earlier, it's about having those validated methods for the regulatory purposes. We're not going to ensure a better protection of the environment and the people unless we've got the right methods to actually do that. And considering it is an EU goal under one of the directives to be ending all tests on animals, actually what the chemical strategy is potentially doing is opening up even more animal testing. And so it's really a lot of Peter's work is focusing on making sure that we've got more development of non-animal methods, better validation, and better implementation, particularly for these areas where we're seeing new endpoints that are now being required to be added to the CLP regulation and also into REACH as well. And this will affect cosmetics because next year they will be opening up the cosmetics regulation. So that means that the bodies responsible for regulating cosmetics and ensuring that data, that could be passed over. That might not be under the same kind of framework in which it happens now. There's going to be additional demands upon cosmetics industry for additional test requirements, additional data. So there is a real risk for a massive increase actually in animal testing.
And Francesca, have any of your members been concerned about this, contacted you about this recently?
Yeah, so I just wanted to build into the conversation. So of course, the chemical strategy for sustainability will affect cosmetics and the cosmetics regulation, not directly because the animal testing ban under the cosmetics regulation will not be lifted and will not be amended. So there will be no change to that and to the ban of animal testing for ingredients and finished cosmetic products. The way that the chemical strategy for sustainability will affect the cosmetics regulation and cosmetics is with the changes of CLP and REACH, for example. So definitely by the end of this year, we understand that CLP and REACH will be open for revision. And there is a public consultation ongoing right now to gain insights from industry and from stakeholders on the new plans for opening the CLP and the REACH. But of course, we don't foresee any change, and we will not allow any change on the animal testing ban, but there can be changes in terms of applicability of the safety data sheets, especially for cosmetic ingredients, on how those safety data sheet can be improved. Or for example, on the CLP hazard labeling, there could be changes on that, but certainly not on the animal testing ban. As an industry, we cannot afford to do that because we do have an animal testing ban, and we are working, we have an obligation on the alternative methods as well under the cosmetics regulation. So there is not going to be any change on that.
Thank you for clarifying, Francesca. William, yes.
Yeah, I'm actually, it's more a question than anything else, because as Julia Vanes had been saying, one of the issues which is being looked at is endocrine disruptors, which is a kind of let's call it a new hazard where we are gaining more and more experience in. And indeed, there's discussions on new test methods to examine those kind of potential hazards. Now, as I said, I'm know about REACH. I'm not an expert of the cosmetics framework, and I'm just curious how will that then impact if this new hazard is now being identified? How can one properly take that into account within the cosmetics framework? I'm just wondering if Francesca or Julia have a view on that. How best to ensure that those hazards are best addressed, and indeed, because we are indeed at an early stages, if they have thoughts of alternative ways than what is now being discussed, let's say, of addressing these, that I think that input should come as quickly as possible, because that can then be incorporated in the relevant pieces of legislation. So it's partly a question and a reflection.
It's a good question. Francesca or Julia, do you have a response?
Do you want to start, or shall I start?
Yeah, I'll start. Yeah, you're right, because endocrine disrupting chemicals will be something that the cosmetics industry will need to take account of. And it is something that we've spoken about at various EU meetings where we're working on the subgroups that are looking at those particular test requirements. We have representatives from the Peter Science Consortium International who are on those committees. And of course, what we are pushing is to make sure that the right methods mean non-animal methods. And the animal data, that the animal kind of tests that are out there, they don't provide the mechanistic information that would necessarily be required. And that's why I'm talking about the regulatory needs. We need to ensure that what people might be using or what might be going into the environment is safe. And we need to make sure that we are ensuring safety that meets those regulatory purposes. So it's no point asking for a test that doesn't do the job. It has to be a reliable test. It has to be a valid test. And those tests simply don't exist to the fullest extent. So really the key on the Commission is put the money into the development and the validation of those non-animal methods.
Yes.
And yes, Francesca.
No, I was checking if I was on mute or not. No, I just wanted to follow up that, I mean, I did mention it earlier that we are not going to lift the animal testing ban, and we are not planning to, do that, and we're going to push for that to remain. But I know Cosmetics Europe, the European Trade Association, who will input directly into the consultation, and the industry should be able to provide enough information to avoid the reopening of the cosmetics regulation in terms of animal testing ban, and provide a lot of alternatives methods. So I'm not directly involved in this work in terms of what alternative methods are available, because that is one of my colleagues at CTPA. But I am working with Cosmetics Europe on the review of the cosmetics regulation, and I can assure that the animal testing ban will not be lifted or changed, but there will be alternatives proposed, or ways to, find a solution to avoid that part happening.
Fantastic. Thank you, Francesca. So, I mean, really to round up, because we only have a few minutes left, and possibly the ECHA team can answer this. Are there any kind of major changes or upcoming things under REACH that the industry should keep an eye out for or keep in mind, in the near future?
Yes, I can start, and then if Laurence wants to supplement. I mean, I think partly the chemical strategy, which was mentioned, is of course the big thing to keep an eye on. They are because it's part of that is really the big overhaul which one can expect of the whole chemicals framework, because it's really covering. It will not only be REACH which is covered, but also other pieces of legislation, and I think that's the most important to keep an eye on. Of course, there are some new developments coming up. We are changing. There are some discussions already going on now about changing some information requirements under REACH to cover the endocrine disruptor information requirements. So some changes may be already made there. There may be also some changes in some clarifications made to some of the REACH to REACH annexes, which contain some information requirements. So it's just more confirmation on how we're doing things, but now putting it more more in stone to make it clear that. But I think the big thing is especially this this chemicals strategy, and I think it's really important to keep an eye on what's going on there. And indeed, I think there are merits to have a one substance, one assessment approach. Let's put it this way. So I do support that. It means that you would avoid 3 different interpretations of endocrine disruptors, because we have now 3 different pieces of legislation. Each one has a slightly different way of interpreting the notion. So it would be good to harmonize certain things like that. And for example, the CLP regulation would be, for example, a very good way to harmonize it by putting specific classification criteria in place for endocrine disruptors, which can then be applied throughout Europe within the context of one piece of legislation, rather than having this issue addressed in 3 or 4 different separate pieces of legislation.
Absolutely. And Laurence?
Yes, maybe I can also add, we have also, since a few years, have taken up the challenge to provide a view on the safety and the need for further EU regulatory management of the substances that are registered. So some of them with mixed uses of chemicals. So we've started really accelerating the screening of substances to form a view on where we should place our prioritization to process the substance further and propose and take some action to indeed further protect human health and the environment. So we are accelerating, looking at all substances. So it's not exactly part of REACH per se, but it will fulfill some higher level objectives from the CSS. Sorry, chemical strategy.
Fantastic, wonderful. So I can see that we're now out of time, unfortunately, but I would love to thank you all so much for joining us today to provide some insight into REACH, its requirements, its relationship with the cosmetics regulation, as well as future developments there too. So William, Laurence, Francesca and Julia, it's been a pleasure having the benefit of your expertise. Thank you. And to our viewers, we are now going to take a short break, but make sure you join us again at 4:10 for Rupert's talk, A Good Influence, Keeping Ambassadors on the Right Side of the Law.
Thank you.